Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into education.
Ooh, exciting.
Yeah, we're going to be exploring some different approaches to education in light of the challenges facing us in society today.
That sounds fascinating, actually.
We've got a really interesting mix of sources.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at some critiques of modern education.
Okay.
We've got some anthropological insights from Margaret Mead.
I love Margaret Mead.
We've also got some stuff from Tolkien and C.S. Lewis,
Oh, wow. The Inklings.
thinking about myth and storytelling.
That's so cool.
And then just to kind of round things out, we'll be comparing and contrasting some modern and traditional child-rearing practices.
I'm really excited to dig into all of this.
Yeah, so I think, a lot of us are thinking about, how do we approach education today in the world that we live in?
It's a tough question.
So hopefully this deep dive will give us some aha moments as we're looking at these different sources and thinking about what we can learn from them.
I think it will.
All right, so let's just jump right in. Why don't we start with some critiques of modern education? Have you ever read Ivan Illich?
I don't think so.
Deschooling Society is one of his books.
Oh, I think I've heard of that.
And he really kind of comes out swinging,
Yeah.
right? He argues that schools as institutions stifle creativity
Interesting.
and they perpetuate inequality.
Wow.
And he rejects this metaphor of this student as product, kind of the factory model of education.
Oh, that makes sense. So he's
Yeah.
saying that we're churning kids out,
Exactly.
not really treating them as individuals.
Yeah, and that this is not really a good approach for nurturing
Yeah.
human flourishing.
Makes a lot of sense.
Now that leads us to another critic, Neil Postman, who wrote Amusing Ourselves to Death.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic.
And he's really concerned about
Yeah.
how TV and just general entertainment are eroding our capacity for, critical thinking
I can see that.
and meaningful intellectual discourse. And he even suggests that education itself
Yeah.
is becoming mere entertainment.
Yes.
Like, we're trying to make it fun,
Right.
but we're kind of losing the substance.
I see what he's saying.
Yeah, so I feel like that connects really well with Nicholas Carr's argument in The Shallows.
Okay, I haven't read that one.
So Carr, he argues that the internet is making us, shallow. Like, our thinking is becoming more superficial.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I mean, just think about how much time we spend scrolling and clicking.
Exactly. And how that kind of trains our brains to just kind of skim the surface.
Right. Instead of diving depth into something.
Yeah. And so he worries that even though the internet has all these advantages, right, it's also kind of rewiring our brains in a way that makes it harder to really focus and engage with complex topics.
And that's a huge problem for education, right? I mean, how can students learn if they can't focus?
It's a massive problem.
It really is.
Now let's bring in Jonathan Haidt and his book, The Coddling of the American Mind.
Interesting title. What's that about?
So Haidt is really concerned about the mental health crisis among young people.
It's a huge problem.
And he links it in part to, some of the trends that we've already been talking about.
Okay.
This constant social media use, but also this decline of play-based childhood.
Interesting. So kids aren't just playing outside anymore.
Exactly. And this free play, this unstructured play, is actually super important for development.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's how kids learn to socialize, solve problems, use their imaginations.
Exactly.
It's so crucial.
And so Haidt argues that by, overscheduling kids
Right.
and not giving them that downtime to just play,
Right.
we're actually kind of hindering their social and neurological development.
That makes a lot of sense.
Okay, so we talked about Illich, Postman, Carr, Haidt.
All pretty critical of modern education.
Right, so let's kind of shift gears a little bit
Okay.
and consider this idea of the social construction of reality.
That's a big one. What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so this idea suggests that our understanding of the world is shaped by the social and cultural norms that we're surrounded by.
Okay, so, we don't just learn facts in isolation.
Right.
We learn them within a framework of meaning that's given to us by our culture.
Exactly.
That's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
Right. And it makes me think back to what Carr was saying about superficial knowledge.
Oh, yeah.
Well, if we're just memorizing facts without really connecting them to a bigger picture,
Right.
a larger context of meaning, then is that knowledge really that meaningful?
That's a good point. It's like learning a bunch of vocabulary words without knowing the grammar to put them together.
Exactly. And so this idea of the social construction of reality, it reminds us that we're not just passive recipients of information.
Okay.
We're actively constructing our understanding of the world
Right.
based on the influences around us.
And that this construction is dynamic, right? It can change over time.
Absolutely. It can be questioned, challenged, and reshaped.
So it's not just about accepting what we're told.
Exactly.
It can critically examine the frameworks that we've inherited.
Yeah. And that leads us to another interesting thinker, Patrick Deneen.
Okay, haven't heard of him.
He wrote a book called Why Liberalism Failed.
Oh, wow, that's a bold statement.
It is.
So what's his argument?
Well, he argues that liberalism, while it's been successful in creating a prosperous society in many ways, has also led to excessive individualism
Okay.
and a loss of meaning.
Interesting.
He's particularly critical of modern universities.
Really? How so?
He sees them as just kind of like credential factories that have lost sight of the pursuit of truth and wisdom.
Ouch. That's a pretty harsh critique.
Yeah, but I think it's something worth considering.
I agree. It's like we've reduced education to just getting a degree to get a job.
Right. And Deneen's critique really kind of like echoes some of the things that Alistair McIntyre talks about.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about him.
So McIntyre wrote a really influential book called After Virtue.
Okay.
And he argues that morality and ethics thrive best within communities
Okay.
that share traditions and values.
So, like, a sense of shared history and purpose?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he's concerned that the modern era lacks this shared moral framework.
I see what he's saying.
And that this makes it difficult to develop strong virtues.
Right. Virtues need a context to flourish, don't they?
I guess so, yeah.
It's not just about individual choices.
Right,
it's
right.
about being part of a community that supports and upholds those virtues.
Exactly. And so McIntyre even calls for like a new St. Benedict.
A new St. Benedict. What does he mean by that?
Yeah, so he's basically calling for like, people to create communities that can kind of resist
Resist what?
the fragmenting forces
Right.
of modern society.
Yeah. That's a powerful idea.
And actually kind of sustain moral values.
Okay, so we've got critiques of modern education. We've got this idea of the social construction of reality.
Yeah.
And this call for creating new communities.
Right.
So where do we go from here?
Well, let's turn to traditional cultures for some insights
Oh, that sounds interesting.
and see what they can teach us about education. So have you heard of Margaret Mead?
Of course. The famous anthropologist.
She was really fascinated by how traditional cultures
Yeah.
transmitted values.
Oh, cool.
And, these cultures, they use things like,
Like what?
well, rituals and storytelling, apprenticeship, rites of initiation,
Okay.
and community participation.
It sounds so much more holistic than what we do now.
Right. It was all about, the whole community participating in the education of
Yeah.
the younger generation.
And elders and authority figures played a key role.
Absolutely. They were seen as the keepers of wisdom,
Right.
the mentors.
Makes sense.
Now, this is obviously a stark contrast to modern society
Definitely.
where, traditional authority has declined,
Uh-huh.
family structures have changed, and we've got this, mass media that's shaping our culture in all sorts of ways.
It's a totally different landscape.
It really is.
So what did Mead think about all of this?
Well, she was actually pretty concerned.
Really?
Why? Because she saw all of these shifts as potentially leading to a crisis of values.
Interesting. Like we're losing our moral compass.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's a concern that a lot of people share today.
Absolutely. It feels like we're adrift in a sea of information and opinions.
Right. And without that, strong foundation of shared values, it can be hard to know what to believe or how to live.
It's a big challenge.
It is. And it's one that we need to be thinking about carefully as we consider the future of education.
For sure. So we've got critiques, social construction, traditional cultures. What's next?
Well, let's talk about stories.
Stories.
Yeah, myth and storytelling.
Oh, I love a good story.
And, it just so happens that we have some fascinating insights from the Inklings.
No way. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis.
The very same.
That's amazing.
Tolkien, he believed that myths and legends were some of the most powerful ways to convey truth. And, coming from him,
Right.
That's a pretty profound statement.
It is, especially since he was a devout Catholic.
Exactly. And he even said that stories are more important than doctrines.
Wow, that's bold.
It is.
But I think I get what he means.
Yeah, because stories, they speak to our hearts in a way that abstract doctrines often don't.
Right.
And Lewis,
Yeah.
he shared this view, too,
He did.
in his writings about myth. He really saw myth as this way to convey truth.
Yeah.
Through imagery and symbolism.
Makes sense.
And to make it more impactful.
So it's not just about dry facts and figures.
Right. It's about engaging our imagination.
And our emotions.
Exactly. And, think about it.
Yeah.
The parables that Jesus used,
Oh, good point.
they were simple stories.
Right.
But they communicated deep truths about God's kingdom.
In a way that was memorable and moving.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it seems like we've got a theme emerging here, right?
What kind of theme?
This idea that traditional approaches to education, they tend to be more holistic.
Okay. I like that.
They engage not only the mind,
Yeah.
but also the emotions, the imagination,
Right.
and even the body.
That's so important. We're not just brains on sticks.
Exactly. And these approaches also emphasize community and shared values, which, as we've seen, is something that's often missing in modern education.
Yeah, it's like we've become so focused on individual achievement that we've forgotten the importance of community.
Exactly. So I think to really kind of drive this point home,
Yeah.
it would be helpful to compare
To compare what?
modern and traditional child-rearing practices
Oh, that's a great idea.
to see these differences a little more clearly.
Let's do it.
Okay, so one major contrast is this idea of individualism versus collectivism.
Okay.
So modern education, especially in the West,
Yeah.
often emphasizes individual achievement and competition,
Right.
while traditional cultures often prioritize
Prioritize.
community and cooperation.
Interest.
And that doesn't mean, competition is always bad,
Right.
but an overemphasis.
Right.
Individual success
Mm-hmm.
can lead to isolation, anxiety.
And maybe even a lack of empathy.
Exactly. So it's about finding that balance.
Makes sense.
Another contrast is formal education versus
Texas.
informal learning.
Oh.
So modern education, it relies heavily on schools
Right.
and structured curricula,
Yeah.
while traditional cultures often emphasize learning through experience,
Better.
observation, and participation in daily life.
So like learning by doing
Exactly.
instead of just sitting in a classroom.
Yeah. Like imagine learning a trade through apprenticeship.
Right.
Or absorbing cultural values through participating in community rituals.
That's so cool.
Right.
Yeah. It's like learning is integrated into everyday life.
It is.
Not separated out into this special time and place.
Okay, now let's talk about curriculum.
Okay.
So modern education often relies on standardized tests
Right.
and a very kind of one-size-fits-all approach,
Yeah.
whereas traditional cultures often used stories and songs and proverbs
Is it cool?
to convey
Knowledge.
and values.
So it's more flexible and adaptable.
Yes, exactly.
And probably more engaging too, right?
Well, think about it.
Yeah.
It's much easier to remember
Yeah.
a captivating story than a list of dry facts.
Oh, absolutely. Stories stick with you.
They do.
They shape how you see the world.
Okay, so another difference is the focus on cognitive development versus
Versus what?
holistic development.
Okay, explain that.
So modern education, especially in its academic forms, it tends to prioritize intellectual development
Right.
above other aspects of human growth
So it's all about like getting good grades.
and scoring high on those standardized tests.
But what about the rest of the person?
Well, exactly, and that's where the traditional cultures,
Yeah.
they come in.
How so?
Because they recognize that education should nurture the whole person.
Their emotions, their character, their physical well-being.
Exactly. And even their spiritual understanding.
It's a much broader vision of education.
It really is.
And it's one that I think we've lost sight of in many ways.
Then we have this contrast between teacher-centric versus community-centric approaches. So modern education often centers on the teacher as the kind of primary source of knowledge.
The sage on the stage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas in traditional cultures, it's much more about the whole community.
Yeah, wow. So everyone's involved in educating the young.
Yeah. Grandparents, elders, aunts, uncles.
Neighbors, everyone.
Exactly. And that creates a much more
interconnected
approach.
I like that.
Yeah.
It's not just the teacher's responsibility.
Right. Everyone has a role to play.
That's cool.
Now, there's also a difference
Yeah.
in the emphasis.
The emphasis on what?
On innovation versus...
Versus tradition.
Okay. I see where you're going with this.
So modern education, it encourages
Yeah.
questioning established norms,
Uh-huh.
embracing new ideas,
Right. Progress.
which, has its merits, of course.
For sure.
But traditional cultures often emphasize
Yeah.
preserving
Describing-
cultural heritage
Right.
and passing on
Passing on
wisdom from previous generations.
So it's about finding a balance.
Yeah, finding a balance between...
Respecting the past
Okay.
and looking to the future.
That's a tough one.
And then, of course, is the big one.
The big one.
Technology
Oh, yeah.
versus...
Versus oral tradition.
That's a huge difference.
It is.
So modern education's all about screens and devices,
It increasingly relies on them, yeah.
while traditional cultures relied on stories, songs, face-to-face interaction.
Exactly.
And there's something really powerful about that, right?
Oh, absolutely.
That personal connection, the power of storytelling.
Yeah, it can foster a much deeper
Deeper.
understanding and appreciation for knowledge.
I agree. Okay, so what's the last contrast?
The last one is age segregation versus intergenerational learning.
Oh, interesting.
So modern education,
Yeah.
it separates children
Like-
by age.
Okay.
Right. You got your kindergartners, your first graders, and so on.
Everyone in their own little boxes.
Exactly. Whereas traditional cultures,
Yeah,
they often involve people of...
of all ages.
Okay.
Learning
Uh-huh.
and working
Okay.
together.
That's cool. Everyone learning from each other.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
you might have, the youngest children learning from the oldest,
Uh-huh.
and the elders passing on their wisdom to the next generation.
It creates a sense of continuity.
Right. And that's something that I think we've really lost in modern society, this sense
For
of
sure.
intergenerational connection.
It's like we've siloed ourselves by age.
We have.
Yeah.
So I think all of these contrasts between
Yeah.
modern and traditional child rearing,
Yeah.
they're really eye-opening.
They are.
And they offer some valuable insights for modern educators.
Right. Because we're not saying that everything modern is bad.
No, not at all.
But maybe we can learn something from these traditional approaches.
Exactly. And find
Yeah.
ways to integrate
Integrate.
some of that wisdom
Uh-huh.
into our current systems.
I think that's a great goal.
Now, one thing that I think is really interesting is this whole idea of human nature.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
And this seems to be like a real point of
Divergence
between
Yeah.
modern and traditional.
traditional approaches to education.
Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. Because it seems like the modern approach often emphasizes individual autonomy.
Right.
Like, you're free to define your own values, your own purpose, without any constraints.
Exactly. And so that can be really empowering.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it can also be a bit overwhelming.
How so?
Well, if there's no shared framework of meaning, no sense of what it means to be human,
Right.
then it's all up to you to figure it out.
Which can be liberating.
But also terrifying.
Right.
Yeah.
And that leads us to the traditional view,
Okay.
which suggests that
Yeah,
humans have a certain nature.
So, like, there are some things about us that are universal.
Yes.
Yes.
Like we have inherent inclinations,
Yeah.
needs that need to be
Need to be.
nurtured and guided
Like, towards
flourishing.
Yeah, makes sense.
So it's not just about letting people do whatever they want. It's about recognizing that we
Right.
have a certain
The certain...
design,
Okay.
a purpose, and that education should be about
About...
helping people fulfill that purpose.
That's a really different way of thinking about it.
It is.
So how does this play out in the humanities?
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
leads us to another really important point of contrast.
Tell me more.
So in a worldview that acknowledges
Acknowledge
a defined human nature,
right?
the humanities, they become a quest
A quest for what?
for wisdom
Oh, okay.
within our shared
speak
human
forward.
story.
Interesting.
So we explore literature, art, philosophy
Oh, yeah.
to understand
To understand.
what it means to be human,
Right.
how to live a good life.
That's a beautiful way to think about it.
But if we reject the idea of human
Yeah,
nature
right.
and we just embrace
Embrace.
complete individual autonomy,
Right.
then the humanities,
Yeah.
they risk becoming
Becoming what?
kind of a self-centered exercise
Uh-huh.
in expressing personal preferences and
Yeah.
opinions.
So, like, it's all about me and what I think.
Exactly.
And there's no larger context or meaning.
Right. And so that can be really fun and interesting, right? Like,
Sure.
I love hearing people's different perspectives,
Me too.
but it can also feel a little,
empty.
I see what you mean.
Like if there's no
Grounding.
no anchor on the self.
Then what's the point?
Exactly. And that's where I think
Yeah.
the wisdom from traditional cultures and the Bible
Right.
becomes so relevant.
Because they offer a different framework.
They do?
One that acknowledges a shared human story. Exactly. And they challenge us to reconsider our assumptions
Assumptions about
modern education.
oh, hey,
And to be open to
different ways of shaping minds and hearts.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's about thinking deeply.
About what?
About what we're passing on to the next generation and being intentional about creating communities that foster genuine human flourishing.
That's a beautiful goal.
It is.
So what makes a Christian understanding of education distinct?
Ooh, that's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's one that we're going to have to save for next time.
Right, cliffhanger. I can't wait.
I know, right? But until then, keep thinking about these things.
Okay.
Questioning, keep exploring.
And keep learning.
Exactly.
I'm excited for part 2.
Me too. So we've been looking at all these critiques of modern education, and we've been exploring some of the wisdom that we can find in traditional cultures.
Right. And it's like, where do we go from here?
Yeah, like how do we actually put these insights into practice?
Right. How do we build communities that actually, foster true human flourishing?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is. And our sources actually give us some pretty cool ideas.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So they suggest that we can be salt and light, right? By creating communities that model a different way of living and learning.
So, like, we're not just talking about abstract ideas.
Right.
We're talking about actually living them out.
Exactly. And, what I think is so fascinating is this idea that these communities can demonstrate that a social construction based on Scripture actually aligns better with the objective reality of human nature and society.
Whoa, okay, unpack that for me.
So you're saying that a worldview rooted in the Bible, a worldview that views humans as created in God's image with inherent dignity and purpose, actually leads to a society that's more in line with, like, the way things really are.
Exactly, because it recognizes that we're not just isolated individuals.
Right.
We're inherently social beings designed to live in community.
Yeah.
And to find meaning in something larger than ourselves.
And that's something that, like, modern society often misses, right?
Totally. It's all about the individual, the self.
So our sources really highlight the role of churches and families in building these communities.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Ideally, a church should be more than just a place you go on Sunday.
Right.
It should be the hub of a vibrant, integrated community.
I love that.
Where people of all ages can learn, grow, and support one another.
That's a beautiful vision.
It is.
But realistically, it's tough, right? Like, a lot of churches struggle to connect with younger generations.
For sure.
And modern life just kind of pulls families in different directions.
It does. But I think that just highlights the importance of being intentional about building these communities. It doesn't just happen by accident.
Right. So, like, what are some practical steps that we can take?
Well, our sources point to things like Christian schools, homeschooling networks, or family school co-ops.
Okay.
These are all examples of communities that prioritize a shared educational philosophy.
And it's not just about choosing a specific school.
Right.
It's about creating a community where parents, educators, and children are all working together towards a common goal.
Exactly. And that goal should be more than just, getting good grades or getting into a good college.
Right. It's about forming the whole person.
Yeah, nurturing character, wisdom, a deep sense of purpose.
Which goes back to that idea of human nature.
It all connects.
It does. So in a worldview that acknowledges a defined human nature, the humanities become a quest for wisdom.
Okay.
We delve into literature, art, philosophy.
Yeah.
To understand what it means to be human, how to live a good life.
It's about connecting with something bigger than ourselves.
Oh, exactly. But in a worldview that prioritizes absolute individual autonomy, the humanities can become kind of self-indulgent.
Oh, yeah. How so?
It's all about expressing personal preferences and opinions without any kind of external reference point.
So, like, it's just my truth versus your truth.
Exactly. And there's no real grounding.
No objective standard.
Right. Which can be fine to a certain extent.
Yeah.
But it can also lead to a sense of meaninglessness.
For sure. Like, if everything is just subjective, then nothing really matters.
Right. And that's where I think the insights from traditional cultures and the Bible are so powerful.
Yeah, because they offer an alternative.
They do.
They remind us that there's a shared human story, that there are objective standards of truth, goodness, and beauty.
And that our lives have a purpose beyond just fulfilling our own desires.
Right. And so education becomes about more than just, getting a job or making money. It becomes about shaping hearts and minds, cultivating virtue.
And preparing people to live meaningful lives in community.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really crucial question.
Okay.
What makes a distinctly Christian understanding of education unique?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah. What sets it apart from other traditional approaches?
I guess we'll have to wait for part 3 to find out.
Stay tuned.